Hi, I'm supposed to use a mic. No, so I think that timing, I didn't realize it was quite as fast as it is. We have until 5 o'clock for everything. So what we'd like to do is just have, maybe people can either tape stuff up or hold stuff up. I think we can be kind of informal at this moment and ask each group to just have a spokesperson or spokespeople who just like talk about what your group talked about for a couple minutes and try to bring that forward, and then we'll break out into a broader discussion of the questions and how to continue this conversation. Okay, I'm going to stop organizing.
Yeah, maybe we just go numerically. So yeah, number one. So Enrique is representing group number one.
Do you want us to sit down, or do you want us to like just stay? Should we just?
Everyone stay in power pose during my presentation.
Okay, we're ready.
Okay.
Right.
Just maybe. So yeah, I got this enormous responsibility of gather this information of all these people who were talking, and they give me a starting point so I don't lose myself. And our starting word was its sustainability in the whole aspect of the term. And then I will run to the question that was, to whom is the institution, to whom is ideal, and something that I guess it will be always different if it's a curator, if it's for an artist, if it's for an audience. The ideal institution will always be a different shape. So what else we talk about? Yeah, I guess maybe the important parts of sustainability goes directly to the context and how local and the global like interconnect, and maybe how this the aspect of site specificity is something really crucial. Like the context will define the ideal terms for this organism to live. From that, we went to the audience and the relevance, and maybe the impact of whatever the goals of this organism is doing, kind of through an active participation, and also to providing a response, like in active dialogues. Maybe I don't know if this also was maybe for us pretty important. And it's also that we discussed a little bit that maybe the size of the institution also changed very much how is ideal or for whom, or yeah. Another aspect, so networking resourcing goes to explosive program catalyst linking knowledge artistic as node. I just read that without really knowing what I'm saying, but yeah. That's something I found very interesting. It's something about like how can an institution create bridges between a very polarized world that we're living, like intellectually or economically, like, or yeah, ideologically. Like I think the world is very polarized and may a lot of ambivalence in the moment. So how can an institution bridge and connect more? Maybe that was something that happened during all the presentation, that a lot of institutions struggle with get audience, and it happens maybe worldwide. Like people are not really interested in what's happening in the art if you're not from the art world. So how to bridge this connection? But of course, it's this never-ending maybe goal that has been through the how to connect with the people. Then maybe we're not connected. That's why maybe that's a reason that we all struggle to get audience, because we are a different world. Could be so. Yeah. So, and there was something else that was mentioned that I don't really understand, which is a backlog, public unrealized ideas and community wishes to create this kind of archive of backlog. I don't know what's that. It's written. And yeah, then we started like flying around with ideas, what could be. And we went to something like a box fight place for curators so they can fight. Or like a boat for cleaning the ocean, that could also be an ideal institution. But goes back again to the idea of sustainability and how the site through the materials and the resources available in the locality, it's creating sustainability by using the things that you have, resources of human, intellectual, or materials, or competences, I guess. And that sustainability is a support in the idea of economic as well. So you create a sustainable model that fits you back again, something like that. So something that someone mentioned, that stability, it's maybe keeping a quality of a program without repeating the methodologies, so somehow reinventing and not being the same, but keeping the quality. That was something could be ideal. And then I went to the allegory of an institution, and we were like, a lot of people mentioned the institution as a organism or entity. And then I thought maybe a good metaphor for an organization or institution would be like to see it as a tree that kind of grows and provides a platform for living other species. It's not like an animal that will run and die or be killed. 2 minutes. Okay. Okay. Yeah. So I guess.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, something.
Is there anybody from group 2 who wants to go? Group 2? You can do it from up there if you can get a mic. We can give you the mic. But I think just for the nature of times, there's a lot more discussion to be had too, but try to keep everyone to like 2 minutes, 2 minutes, 3 minutes.
Yeah, fine. Could I request the 2-minute person sits in the middle of there and holds up the 2 minutes? Could you sit? Thank you very much. Okay, and that's wonderful. And make sure you hold it up the right way. We had an unfortunate problem within this group. There was 6, 7 people together, and people spoke from 7 different positions. So, I mean, it was a particularly difficult situation. Happily, there was no blood left on the table at the end of it. Some of the thoughts around it, there could be no conclusions drawn within 30 minutes, but some of the thoughts around it were to do with the idea of, and unfortunately, I'm going to speak a lot about what I was thinking about because I've got the microphone, is the idea of within what we're dealing with here, which is in the level of smaller institutions in a sense. Maybe you won't even use the word institution. So the idea of how you get an ideal is probably, I think we came to the conclusion in the end, is to do with diversity. It's to do with different approaches. It's to allow different approaches on different levels. One aspect to most of the presentations that have been made here, and I think is I personally think is very, very important to remember, behind all the projects that have been presented here, there's some idiot who's dreamed up these things, and somebody who's crazy enough to push projects through, spaces through, ideas through, and make them live. And for me personally, I think that's the lifeblood of this situation, that the fact is you don't get too logged down in a vast amount of administration and financial restrictions. The question of how people survive financially, we came in with very different approaches. The idea of people, perhaps participants should be paid, should be remunerated correctly. The idea of whether that might restrict freedom, sort of end flexibility. These are all complex things we talked about. But I think there's also one thing that did come up, which I think is certainly worth remembering, is the role that large institutions play, which allows this situation infinitely more flexibility. And maybe that is the godsend, is that the fact is you have major museums who are actually taking up some of the slack, and therefore we have to look for the space which is being left and be able to And be able to operate within that structure, being aware of what the big boys are doing. So as little boys, we can keep running.
Hello. Yeah, I'm speaking for Group 3. My name is Mohammed. I'd like to acknowledge Group 3 first. I think it's a good thing to acknowledge who's was part of this, just not keep them anonymous. So in my group, there was Ellie here, Fernanda, Luis, don't know where he is. Yes, there he is. Dulcie, can't find her. And of course, who else? 1, 2, 3, did I miss someone? And Christine, of course, yeah. No, Fernanda's here. Where is she? There she is, and Christine. Yeah, unlike the group 2, we were. I think it was quite a harmonious conversation. We tend to have been speaking from very similar positions, and we came to similar conclusions at the end. We started out by being a little bit skeptical of the 2 questions that were posed for us. So we were skeptical of the binary of success failure to start with, so we couldn't really deal with that. Maybe we were a bit too lazy to deal with that. And of course, the ideal kind of also, using a word like the ideal institution kind of presumes a system of copying, right? The ideal, then it means there's an ideal and there's a copy, right? Then we're producing an ideal, basically. So also something we didn't really want to go into. So quickly, instead we thought it would be better to start to try and envision or talk about what kind of conditions we would rather be working with, what kind of conditions we would like to reproduce through our projects or work within or try to affect. So, and I'm going to try to go through some of them without, of course, they're not exhaustive, but some of them. So, of course, again, better working conditions, which is what Group 2 was talking about in terms of remuneration, payment, how people are labor conditions within our institutions. Trying to avoid replicating heteronormality, certain forms of hegemonies that are around us in our societies, within our institutions. The idea of world building was brought in as well, like what kind of worlds, tiny little worlds we're producing within our institutions and how they are, how they stand as opposed to the real world we're living within. Finding new ways to do things differently. I think differences here is an important. I think the emphasis is the word different. Friendship came up as well. I think this is something that maybe is slightly neglected when we talk about the type of institutions that we are instituting in here. That they rely a lot on friendship. How can we turn friendship into kind of an institutional parameter to think about within how we work? And of course, to find ways to create, to be actually not just create, but to be better allies to each other. What are the forms of alliances that we could formulate between ourselves, between our institutions? Thank you.
And I don't think it should be me. I'm here. Do you want to come and then we will be with you.
Oh,
We should at least be our full group.
yeah. We're missing somebody. Okay. So we weren't lazy, but we were kind of easy on this subject, and I would say quite philosophical and a bit poetic. So we thought that we would like to get rid of these 2 words, ideal and institution. And actually, the first question that we raised is, do we need them? And kind of then we followed with a few of the status or kind of forms how we would describe these, let's say, institutions or forms of projects, movements, whatever we call them. And yes, so now I got lost. We were, so we could start with the confusion, because also that this is something we were speaking about in different, like taking on our own experience, what we've done before, and how actually, while working in different kinds of projects and institutions, what we have done, and yeah, kind of like what's the outcome of it. And yeah, the presence of alcohol and drugs also was something we discussed, and all these altered states of mind that sort of sometimes helps, sometimes get you in trouble, but is present and should be bear in mind. And diversification of opinions. Don't know what was that there meant. Yeah, all that go together is with that. And I will go here. We also kind of tried to think of the success, but I guess we kind of felt quite good about previously heard the sentence of safe space, and this is also something we kind of consider is valuable and should be kept as a thing always like bear in mind. And yeah, all these words: visibility, responsibility, accountability. Nothing much to kind of. Maybe you want to complete.
No, but we're done. We can't say
Oh, sorry. So sorry for that. Sorry.
Okay.
Hello, my name is Hanna. And
Hild, and
Yes.
maybe the rest of group 5 could also raise their hands.
or stand up. Yeah. So we started also the discussion, questioning the questions, of course, and then we prefer to start with the first question, and we're not that preoccupied with the question of success. And we decided, sort of mid-discussion, we kind of reached a point of conclusion that we thought we would talk from, which is the commitment to freedom of expression, that no matter where or what context that you operate in, whether it's Beirut or Oslo, two very different places of context, and if you operate within a very pressured context like in Beirut, or a very privileged with a lot of funding situation in Oslo, you have this commitment to freedom of expression in as a sort of platform. Yeah.
Add something to that. Then we also talked about, in terms of that special question of success, we talked about how to create spaces where there is room to not be successful. Spaces that allows for mistakes, and that allows for things that is not so possible to measure. Yeah, and then
and then the question arose: do you need to be strong to be able to make mistakes, and in what way? And then we were led into this question of the parameters, how success is often measured by funding bodies and different things. And there's like this, it creates this element of guilt within the organization that you're not fulfilling all these things, and how to tackle the guilt. So just tackle the guilt. Okay, we have 1 minute left.
But that doesn't count. That it counts here with a lot of funding bodies, but it also counts in other contexts where you have to feel that you, for example, have to do 20 shows a year, and do you really have to do that? Maybe you could do one. And then we also talked about, connected to the question of time, room for time for the artists, and to really develop some artistic rigor that connects to the freedom of expression question, what we are actually doing.
Yes, and then to end the beginning, then to go back to the beginning, sorry. The whole discussion really started with questioning the question of what is ideal and for whom, and then to really embrace the urgency of the context and the moment that you're operating in.
Wait. Okay, we are group 6. We can raise your hands. I guess this was the format. Hi. So we were talking, we were trying to respond to the question about what would be the ideal institution, and we decided to go back and try to understand what is an institution, and considering the various scales of the institutions included and the various stages of their existence, we kind of tried to think about it maybe as like some exchange that is generated by someone or a group that instigates some kind of exchange and open it up. So that was the framework. And then that person, the founder or a group of founders, and the personal or professional motivations that's behind the institution, that might be leading to what's an ideal one, or what is a success or failure, where that motivation or need or desire meets a certain kind of a need of a community or a context that creates some kind of symbiotic or just supportive relationship. Then that is kind of what an ideal institution is. It's this kind of successful meeting point. And of course, the success or the failure depends on the goal that is defined. That goal could be defined retroactively, I guess, sometimes. Yeah, and that I guess, yeah, I don't know. I think that were what we were thinking, and we were trying to think about examples, and this is in the local context, I guess, was thought of. Examples I don't know, but maybe you want to.
Yeah, we had one example, Fellesverksted, which is pretty much an art academy without the faculty. You can go and build everything that you cannot build when you graduate, and it's artist-initiated project that started 7 years ago and is now a artist-owned factory in the same street as the National Academy, with 35 million put it to build this building. So it's a great project and initiative from Oslo artists. Fellesverksted. Fellesverksted.
Yeah, I think that's it.
Yeah, here. I think we also had a problem with the idea of what's an institution. So we sort of focus more on trying to figure out what's an institution, and therefore, and then define what's success and what's an ideal institution. We didn't write anything we couldn't agree in a specific idea of institution. I think there were some points of views of perhaps an institution should be something that could be passed on. I think it was approached by some of the talks earlier. Not everyone in the group, maybe including me, agrees with this. So we sort of spent a lot of time talking about how can an institution die? Is it possible for like the main I guess panel last time? But I think one of there's sort of a paradox of thinking what's an ideal institution and what is success, because perhaps an ideal institution it is fulfilling the ideas that they set of success. So if perhaps you don't set an idea of success you're already an ideal institution in some way. But we talked very much about context as well. I think everyone came here, talked about their own approaches in their own cities, and but one thing I guess we missed is to think to like present these institutions in a more historical way. Like it seems like everyone had a great idea and found an institution, but I haven't seen much how previous institutions sort of paved the way to the institutions that are talking now. So yeah, we digress, we didn't find any solutions.
Placed. Hi, I'm Lima. I'm from Kim Contemporary Art Center and representing Team 8 with Oscar and Ina and Elena. We're a really small little group, and we actually spent some time getting to know each other as well. And no poster because no conclusions, but we talked about quite a few things actually, and also had a healthy debate about the idea of what's the difference between an organization and an institution, and what is the baggage that comes along with something being an institution. And we talked about the idea of multitude and context specificity, but the things that really came forward were the ideas of commitment for an institution. Is it commitment to a community? Is it commitment to an artist? Is it commitment to the artistic product that comes out? And we also talked a lot about sustainability, which overlaps with the first group as well. If you think about sustainability in terms of sustainable infrastructure, or whether you think about sustainability in terms of how does the organization or the institution function, and how do you make sure that the artists get paid and that the people working there don't burn out. And we did slightly touch on the idea of measures of success, and I think pretty much all of us had this allergic reaction to quantitative measures. And I think we returned to Signal's discussion yesterday, and Elena talked about love. There's a lot of ideas of love as well, and taking a slower pace and thinking of quality over quantity, and the idea of taking care of each other. So that's that. You don't have to raise the sign.
Well, I liked the evocation of Group 5, the spaces that can allow for mistakes. I think that it's very clear that a little more time might have been useful here for this last set of discussions, but this is always something to be learned. And I think that this conference is meant to be a starting point rather than an ending point. So yeah, I think well, we're trying to figure out whether. Like,
But should we had also made some notes, but in a way, maybe I don't know if we should just throw those out there, or we should rather just have a mutual discussion tailing this.
I mean, we've got. I'm sorry, the time's so tight. We've got 25 minutes, and I think it's really a question. Like, we have some kind of almost like summary thinking through like the last 2 days, but I'm sure there are also still questions. I'm speaking like not on. I don't know, man. I'm avoiding the mic.
Totally.
What
I'm
do
holding the
people
mic.
want to do now for the next 25 minutes? Is that a fair question, or is that too?
It's too much.
Yeah, give us some feedback. I mean, if you're up to it, if you feel like.
Oh, you want us to give you?
You want us? Okay, yeah.
You want summary?
Okay. Oh, okay.
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 I thought that was the royal us of everyone in the conference, not us necessarily, but yeah.
Okay, but then we should all take my.
I mean, we could like. I like the improv.
Maybe just stay.
So feedback really quickly. I just wanted to respond to some of these, our 2-minute presentations, which were interesting. Our presentation was, like our workshop, there was so much happening, but I appreciated a lot of things that were said. I like the gentleman talking about how it's essentially crazy to start one of these spaces. Like it requires a certain minimum of madness. And then I think it was group 7, which also spoke about historical context, which is something that could have been developed or more, a bit more present throughout the conference.
Yeah, and maybe sort of saying a little bit about that. We had sort of a very early stage of the conference in its sort of incubation, initiation, was to have a much more kind of maybe a 3-day conference and have a full day for the kind of historical context and but we ended up wanting to focus on the voices of the different institutions, and I sort of felt that one of the maybe one sort of interesting thing in that, and that sort of takes, I'm going to simply quote, I think, my art wife saying something about the sort of complexity in the particular, and that in a way it feels like, and I think that's also one of the things that was summed up by more of the groups at this point, that all these institutions are not down for the nonce, in a way made for a very particular site at a very particular moment in response to a very particular context, and that complexity, of course, makes for each of these little and big and very ambitious, or at least utopian projects to kind of dig out their own space, and in a way, in that sense, also coming back to the question of an institution, maybe changing the idea of what an institution even could be.
Well, I mean, yeah, just to build on that for a second, I mean, yeah, this idea of heterogeneity, which seems super important. I mean, obviously, it's an extremely, like, even within the rubric of small, quote, small to medium scaled independent art institutions, which all of which as terms we could actually just keep discussing. I think that there's a lot of the heterogeneity seems important to emphasize, and also the attempt here and hopefully further on to get into these specifics. I mean, I thought, Primer, for example, made a really good point. They talked about, well, in a different context slightly, but they talked about diversifying the art field. And I thought that is, even though in that context, I think that Primer was talking about the idea of also the kinds of discourses and the kinds of ways that artists interact with, whether it's companies or other contexts. I think that's also an important thing here, in the sense that rather than trying to come to a singular conclusion about what an art institution ought to be or an ideal institution, to try and consider the range of voices that are sustainable and that are productive. I liked somebody's use of the term tree, and maybe it was group 1, that it is actually giving shade or giving shelter to something else.
And maybe that sort of hinges to another thing that came up actually in Lars Bang Larsen's talk, quoting Derrida. He said something, well, one man quoting another man said something about no world, only islands. And then I think Dulcie said something lovely this morning about the Bande in Bande and the kind of connections between all these heterogeneous or very sort of different institutions, or whatever we want to call them, and that in a way the kind of that there might be a thinking here about communities and the band between us and within our different, or around our different institutions, and that maybe there is no such thing as only islands, or maybe there's a utopian potential to bridge here.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's one thing I'm definitely taking away from this conference. It's funny, it's a bit of a contradiction, and Prem just touched upon that, but it's that we should end on this question of what is an ideal institution. And I think this conference looks, in the end, speaks to the possibility of different kinds of institutions and a real heterogeneity, and like that are radically different. I was impressed by numerous presentations, but after listening to Christine Tomé and then having to speak about Lulu, as just how totally different these things were. And then she mentioned something to me at dinner last night, and I felt almost apologetic. And she said, no, this is actually quite important, that these kind of, we don't want to go towards a kind of hegemony of a singular institution, but a kind of diversity of institutions and ideas that can kind of support and nurture each other through a kind of acknowledged coexistence.
Yeah, maybe maybe coexistence makes sort of leads on to the idea that actually was in, I guess it's like in the headline of Chris Krause's talk, and comes back to this idea of communities. But we talked about people to dream with, or the idea of some utopian dream. That I think actually, Michael, you raised as well, this idea of like this kind of stupidity of dreaming up things and then trying to make them become a thing in the world, at least for a little while, which meant that sort of comes back to this, I think, and that was something New Theodore Kalla talked about, which is almost the opposite, where she said, I like to kill things. And that there's and maybe sometimes the incessant commitment, the kind of complete totalization of embeddedness that I also think came up in Chris Krause's talk this morning, of like giving your all is also coming with a need, sort of an avant-garde need to kill things, to start anew, and then you could sort of maybe come with a kind of more Buddhist version of that, you know, even if you kill things, they live on in different versions. But there was something there.
Yeah, I think one other thing, like to go back to this idea of like craziness, also is something that I took from Fernanda's presentation from Pivo, and that I generally get from Fernanda, and that is this kind of resourcefulness and the commitment to continually finding resources despite the instability of her funding and programming. And I think that's something, again, that speaks to the kind of general madness of each one of our respective projects, is like continually making it happen. And I thought that was like a really, I guess you could say, noble example of that.
And with resourcefulness goes, I think I thought it was wonderful how Group 8 kind of talked about both love and care. And I think that's something that obviously that came up in Signal's presentation, but also came up in the group discussion that I was part of the workshop, which was the idea of kind of giving more than you take. That in some ways that it's hard to determine what is the institutional goal, like whether on the one hand, is it, I mean, Anthony in his presentation about the Artists Institute said, big doesn't mean exclusive, small doesn't mean, big doesn't mean inclusive, small doesn't mean exclusive, like to try and break down the binary or the typical ways that we sometimes talk about institutions. But on the other hand, I think there is this real question of who is being served, what is the purpose, why does it exist? And like one, like maybe potential meta principle is this one of generosity, of giving more than you take, or a tree that gives shelter. Like, is the institution existing in order for the institution to exist? Or is the institution existing for artists or for other people to keep something away from it? I think that also, I mean, there's something that really struck me in the Så finns ett Skola's presentation about the idea of there's something about being ordinary. That was a phrase that came up, the idea of being ordinary and drinking coffee with people, that there's something very embedded in that. Rather than being outside of a thing, you're in a thing. And that also, that continuity means that it's harder to overvalue one side or the other.
Yeah, I love that as well. The importance of being ordinary as opposed to extraordinary, and as such, developing community. that's something I could definitely work on in my own institution.
Yeah, but then at the same time, I think what kept on coming up was this idea, and you actually said that earlier, the idea of parody and hyperbole, which would be almost the opposite of being ordinary. In a way, the exaggeration or the going for the complete improbable. So Kunsthalle Lissabon would be a good place to set out the imaginary institution before there is an institution, the lineal that you're running yourself. And I would take my own institution praxis into account here too. And yeah, maybe the need for that, sometimes sort of enormous hyperdimensionality to say something, to maybe hope that you can yell a little bit beyond your own circuits, or drum up something. And the question if that's working, but that would be a question to all of us then.
And again, I feel like we're kind of setting up this thing where like it could be this or it could be that, which maybe is also to be continued to digest. But on the other hand, there is the kind of hyperbole, and maybe I like the word yelling, because I found myself also on stage like feeling maybe too forceful. But it's the counterpoint to that is the phrase that Osaka used when talking about asakusa, like the fact that it can value silence, that it allows people silence. Like that was a really beautiful evocation, more in the mode of somebody who participates in it from the other side, but what a space like this can offer, even if it has a kind of forceful mission. I mean, I think that sorry.
No.
I mean, and I think that there's also, one of the things about being even in this situation, and we've suggested this before, but it is also, we're not here as neutral agents. There are no neutral agents. We have an agenda as well, have people who have run spaces of continuously. And I think that was somehow evoked really strongly for me also in Louise Daney, in them mentioning the fact that you can't just stand at the wall. Like in their space, the intimacy of that is that you must be part of it. You are affecting it. You are always, like, even doing this conference is a way of, for better or for worse, kind of influencing the ecosystem of the institutions in the room and perhaps beyond, that there's no way to kind of just observe that thing.
And I think this is the sort of the moment that I want to bring up the poster that was like my ideal image of this conference before it became the running through Louvre, and in that sense sort of abandoning obviously sort of museal laws of how to behave and move your body, which kind of leads back to the body, and the body as a sort of circle of life, or a sort of bodily idea of an institution also being something that goes through different phases. But what I wanted to say is that the poster I had proposed for as our cover image is this wonderful poster by the now deceased Are Sture Johannesson. And it says, turn on the institutions, and then underneath, and then it's you have the Swedish palace. So it says that above the Swedish palace, and below it says the kingdom lies within you. And that of course brings back this point of institutions being whether institutions are tied to people, how much they're tied to people, how much the people are the institutions they make, if they can be passed on, and which kind of life cycles they go through.
Yeah, I think we can actually start to wrap it up here. I mean, we have 3 minutes. It would be great to ask if there are any questions, but or comments, but we're also going to have drinks outside, right?
Yeah. Which is but let's take a moment of silence for comments first. Thank you.
Thank you to everyone who's also been both a speaker and
stayed for the 2 days.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm just going to make a final note on the sort of social aftermath, pre-math, I hope too, during. I'm very happy that the group I was in brought up alcohol. And then, of course, Chris Kraus this morning spoke about all kinds of other drugs. So let's forget about that. But and the mundane and the coffee. And we've been through a lot of coffee. I'm happy you've shared that with all of us. I hope you're as jittery as I am at this point, because that's certainly a state of elevation that every Norwegian or based in Norwegian kind of person has to go through every day. So hoping you're as jittery. Let's go outside and there's alcohol, there's a glass of bubbles. And then it's previously been suggested that we would go somewhere else for food. And that's been completely abandoned because that somewhere else was dependent on good weather. So the weather report turned. So we're gonna just, and that's also much easier and maybe even nicer to just stay here if you want. And I would suggest whomever wants to stay stays to have a bite. But that's of course entirely optional. So having said that, thanks again to everyone, to all the contributors, to everyone in the audience, to my fellow ménage à trois companions, and for all the love.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.